Probably the most important thing in any painting is the block-in of your composition. That is from the very first strokes where you start placing objects on the canvas, and those first few decisions are going to have the most impact of anything that you do in the painting. Now, if you're like me and you work from photos, you go to great lengths to try and compose beautiful compositions to work from. And so I then go on Photoshop. I do a lot of work there to try to get the compositions just as effective as possible. But then once you've done that, then it becomes a matter of how do we transfer that composition onto the canvas? Because if you can have the greatest photograph in the world to work from, and the composition can just be absolutely spectacular, but if you end up moving things and changing the proportions inadvertently on your canvas, then you can take that great composition and it can become a very weak composition. So in today's episode, I'm going to show you the method that I've come up with transferring my compositions from my photographs onto the canvases. When I first started painting, I would often have that problem of, I'd have a great photo to work from. And then when I would go to kind of copy the composition or draw the composition out on my canvas, the finished painting wouldn't be nearly as effective as the photo that I was working from. And I came to realize that's because, what drew me to that photo in the first place probably was a really strong composition in terms of an effective way of breaking up the space and leading the eye through the painting. And then when it came time to actually doing the painting, I would inadvertently move things, and so that the proportions, the actual design changed, but it didn't change intentionally. It changed just accidentally because of not drawing it accurately. And I came to realize that if I was going to go to all this trouble to shoot great photos and compose great photos, that it was really important at that initial block-in stage that I be aware of if and when I'm changing or departing from the composition in the photo, and only do it when it was going to make the composition better, and not to do it to deter from the composition. So I fell back on a kind of tried and true old school way of transferring things, which is with a grid. Now I just use a grid that divides the canvas horizontally and vertically in threes. And I do this for a couple of reasons. One is that the law of thirds, which is something that's it's basically akin to golden section, but whereas golden section is a very specific mathematical formula based on a square and the diagonal and an arc from the diagonal, what it basically boils down to is that when you divide the space in thirds, no matter what the proportions of the space, dividing it in thirds is usually fairly pleasing to the eye. And that's also a good place to, if you have a strong vertical or you have a strong horizontal, it's good to have it rest on one of those lines of the thirds. And also in terms of, for a center of interest, the places where these lines intersect are very, very stable compositionally. They're not too far off to the edge that they're going to unbalance the painting, but they're also not too close to the center that it's going to create a static composition. So by dividing the canvas in thirds, it reminds me of those divisions of thirds, which allows me to kind of nudge, whether they be tree trunks or horizon lines or whatever. If it comes close to that line, I'll often nudge it up or down or left and right so that one of the strong edges sits on that law of thirds. The other thing that it does is it just makes it a little easier to transfer the actual composition accurately. So you can see on this photo here, I have the same division of thirds drawn on my photo, and I just do that with a Sharpie marker. And what that allows me to do is to landmark all of the major divisions of space within these little squares. I find it very easy, you know, if I want to place where the edge of a tree is or where the end of a tree is, with these grid marks on here, I can be much more accurate than if I was just doing it from this little square to this little square with no reference points. And what I'll also do for a great big painting, because I'll often create a 4-foot by 6-foot painting from an image not much larger than that. Well, then it becomes really, really difficult in terms of where on that 6-foot canvas does a certain branch go, or a tree, or the horizon line. So if I'm working on a bigger canvas, I might actually divide it. I still usually only do thirds. Say it's a 4-foot by 6-foot canvas, maybe thirds vertically, but horizontally I might divide it into 6 or 12. And again, that just helps me landmark where things go, so that if I have a really strong composition on my image, my photo, then I want to make sure that I have just as strong a composition in my painting when I block it in, and I at least know when I'm transgressing from where things are in the photo. And often I will change them, but I'll do it knowingly, and I'll do it with an intent of improving the composition. So assuming that this is something that you're interested in doing, the question then becomes, how do we get this grid on the canvas? And it seems like, wow, it should be easy. But there you can actually run into all kinds of problems, and I can just share you kind of my experiences with this. The very first time I started trying to do this, I thought, well, I'll just draw it in pencil on the canvas. Well, the problem we have with graphite is it migrates through paint. So if you put the graphite down on here, and then you put an area of white paint or sky or something on it, that graphite will bleed through and will show through the paint. And it will actually even potentially come through the acrylic and then through the oils. So then I tried, for a number of years, I used markers, magic markers, or Pentel design markers. But the problem there too was that sometimes that line, if you use like a Sharpie, that line is so harsh. If you paint anywhere on the canvas with kind of thinner, transparent areas of paint, that line will still show through. Even though it's not bleeding through, it will still show through strong enough that you can see it underneath transparent applications of paint. And then I also had the issue with several markers, and I guess it's because they were like an oil-based marker, where it actually bled through the acrylic, unbeknownst to me, and then even through the oil painting, where, you know, you paint on it and everything looks fine, and you come back the next day and you can see that the ink has migrated again to the front of the oil paint. So now you're having to wait for it to dry and then go over and recoat those areas. So I've come up with a pretty simple, basic way to put this grid onto the canvas where you don't have any of those issues, and you're never going to have any of those issues. And what I do, so I use fluid acrylic. So I use the golden fluid acrylic, which is what I also use to do my block-ins. And I just put a little bit on a paper plate, and I use these really worn down brushes. That's why I hardly ever throw out a brush, because you'll always find a use for them later on for something. So these old worn out brushes, you know, they're not great for doing a lot of things, but they're really, really good for doing what they do best. And that is anytime you want to draw with the brush. So anytime you want to make a mark with a brush that's similar to what you'd make with a pencil or a piece of charcoal or a marker, these are great for that. So I've already drawn on here 3 of my 4 grid lines. And I've got a little bit of the acrylic paint in here. And I've got my marks already made. I will line them up. And using this brush, I can draw a line on there that's going to be, you know, it's archival. That means it's not going to kind of damage the painting in any way. It's not going to bleed through. It's just acrylic, which is the same that I use for my whole underpainting. I can also make it kind of as bold or as kind of subtle as I want just by choosing which color. I find using the purple works out good because I do a lot of my blocking with purple, so it will kind of disappear once I start blocking in the composition. And again, it just helps me landmark my composition, whether I want to adjust things slightly for that law of thirds, or I just want to make sure I'm accurately transferring the composition from my photo. The other thing I find very helpful, one of the things I find most difficult to do is to draw a perfectly horizontal line on the canvas. So when I'm doing a scene that has a lake in it, for example, where it's a flat horizon, these lines here give me something to go against to make sure that my horizon is in fact level, because if your horizon's on an angle, then it could look like it's a river, not a lake. So I hope you found that helpful. I know this really works for me when it comes to the block end. So if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe. I welcome your comments and questions, and please help spread the word about my channel. I'm Tim Packard, and I thank you for your time.